Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Robinson, and I am the Dean of the University of Chicago Divinity School. It is my great pleasure, my extraordinary pleasure, to welcome you to tonight's event, entitled The Black Church in Chicago, Past, Present, and Future. We appreciate so very much your presence at this important conversation about one of the most vital, powerful, transformative institutions in the city of Chicago, the Black Church, from 4 of its most respected leaders. Before I introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our speakers, let me say a few words of gratitude. I would like to thank, first of all, the Baptist Theological Union, whose efforts in partnership have made this event possible. For those members of the BTU here, please stand and make yourself known. Thank you also to DuSable African American History Museum and Education Center for being such an excellent host tonight. And finally, thank you to the staff and faculty of the Divinity School who have brought this event to life. You all have my most sincere gratitude. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to tonight's moderator, Christian Mitchell. Christian Mitchell is Vice President for Civic Engagement for the University of Chicago. As VP, Christian is responsible for overseeing the Office of Civic Engagement, including state and local government relations, as well as the Office of Business Diversity and Commercial Real Estate Operations. In this role, Christian, if I may, Christian is tasked with building civic engagement, partnerships with academic and administrative units at the university, and engaging community and corporate partners to build durable relationships and partnerships for economic opportunity on the south side of Chicago and in the region. Prior to becoming vice president, Christian served as deputy governor for public safety, energy, and infrastructure for Illinois Governor Pritzker. Prior to serving as deputy governor, Christian was a state representative from Illinois' 26th district, serving 3 terms representing the Chicago lakefront from the Gold Coast to South Chicago. In 2018, Christian served as executive director of the Democratic Party of Illinois, becoming the first African American to lead the state party. He began his career as a community organizer on Chicago's South Side, working for Southsiders Organized for Unity and Liberation. Christian Mitchell is a 2008 graduate of the college, University of Chicago, with a degree in public policy. He graduated with his JD from Loyola Chicago School of Law in 2019 and is a member of the Illinois Bar. Please join me in welcoming Christian.
Thank you, Dean, for the kind introduction. Despite that overlong intro, I am not nearly cool enough to be on this stage. And I say that because I'm sitting with men who I greatly admire, some of whom I've known for years, a luminary who I've just met for the first time. So I'm going to start by introducing them, and I'm going to start with my friend, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III. He's a third-generation warrior for civil and human rights, and has built his ministry on community advancement and racial and social justice activism. As senior pastor of the Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, Illinois since 2008, Dr. Moss routinely preaches and practices a black theology that unapologetically calls attention to the problems of mass incarceration, environmental justice, and economic inequality. Dr. Moss is part of a generation of ministers committed to preaching a prophetic message of love and justice, which he believes are inseparable companions that form the foundation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. As part of his community engagement through Trinity United Church of Christ, Dr. Moss is currently providing vision for an ongoing multi-year project in Chicago called Amani Village. The goal of Amani Village is to develop and build a physical and social community at 95th and Cottage Grove, gateway to Chicago's historic Pullman community. The project is designed to provide all of the components a community would need to be whole, including a medical health center, lodging for tourists, housing for multiple generations, multiple options for fresh food and vegetables, and a sports and recreation center. A native of Cleveland, Ohio, Dr. Moss is an honors graduate of Morehouse College, who earned a Master of Divinity from Yale Divinity School and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Chicago Theological Seminary. He's the author of many books and articles, including most recently Dancing in the Darkness, Spiritual Lessons for Thriving in Turbulent Times, which I can confirm is available on Amazon because I ordered it 2 weeks ago. I would ask, we are again joined by a luminary in Otis Moss Jr., and I would ask his son if he wouldn't mind saying just a few words of introduction for him.
Thank you so much, Christian. First of all, I want to say thank you to the University of Chicago, the University of Chicago School of Divinity for allowing us to be here. I want to say thank you to my pop, Dr. Otis Moss Jr. He was just coming along he just wanted to come, and because of Dr. Hatch said, I've got an idea, and we would love it for you to be on this panel. And I have to say that he is my not only homiletical hero, my pastoral hero, but he allowed in the household that I developed in, knowing that being a pastor and a father was not an oxymoron. And it's such a beautiful thing to have him next to me. So just a little bit of background. My father is also a graduate of Morehouse College. There we go. A graduate of the Interdenominational Theological Center and received his doctorate of ministry from the United Theological Seminary. But I want to give you a little bit of background in terms of his deep commitment to social justice. While a student at ITC, he organized with several other students, and they put together what was called the Appeal to Human Rights, which became the Atlanta Sit-In Movement. A few other individuals that you may know, such as Marion Wright Edelman, they got together and they literally desegregated Atlanta, Georgia. Later on, he was tapped after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was Martin Luther King Sr. who asked my father if he would come and be the co-pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. He's been deeply committed to this idea of love and of justice. He was tapped by Jimmy Carter to spend time at Camp David along with other religious leaders to discuss issues that were happening in the Middle East. He was a part of the founding of what we know as Rainbow Push and was a close colleague of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As a matter of fact, it was Dr. King who was the person who performed the marriage ceremony between my mother and my father. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Dr. King. I like to say that. So he has a million stories. He literally has met and knows everybody because I'm still finding out about the people he used to hang out with, one being Fannie Lou Hamer, who used to come by the house. And I was like, what, are you kidding me? He's like, oh, yeah. So we just have a wealth of knowledge up here. And Dad, thank you so much. He got off a plane several hours ago and wanted to hang out and come here to the University of Chicago and to the DeSabo Museum. So thank you for allowing Pop to be with us tonight.
And we'll hear more from him shortly. Let me introduce our other two panelists just briefly. Let me go with, since he's closest, I'll go with Marshall Hatch Jr., who is the founder and executive director of the MAAFA Redemption Project, a faith-based residential institute for Black and brown young men who are furthest from opportunity. The MAAFA project provides housing, job skills development, educational opportunities, and wraparound social services. These supports are supplemented with programming that focuses on the arts, cultural identity development, spiritual enrichment, transformative travel, civic empowerment, and insistent life coaching and mentoring. Mr. Hatch is a 2010 graduate of Bates College, as well as a double alumnus of the University of Chicago, where he earned a master's from the Crown School of Social Work and a master's of divinity from the Divinity School. We'll also say, as a plug for OCE, in 2020 and 2021, he was a fellow in the University of Chicago Harris School's Public Policy Civic Leadership Academy, which started at the Office of Civic Engagement. Give him a round of applause. Finally, last but very much not least, is the Reverend Dr. Marshall Hatch Sr. Reverend Dr. Marshall Elijah Hatch Sr. is the pastor of the New Mount Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church, located in the heart of Chicago's West Garfield community, where he has served since 1993. Reverend Hatch is a native of Chicago's West Side. His spiritual development began in Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church under the pastorate of his father, the late Reverend Elijah Hatch. In 1985, he was ordained as a minister, and later in that same year was appointed as pastor of the Commonwealth Missionary Baptist Church in North Lawndale. Pastor Hatch has earned both master's and doctorate's degrees from McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois. He also holds a master's degree in government from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and a bachelor's degree in political science from Western Illinois University in Macomb, Illinois. Since 2009, he has served as a professor of urban ministry at Northern Seminary in Lisle, Illinois, and previously served on the faculty at his alma mater, McCormick Theological Seminary. Throughout his ministry, Marshall Hatch has commenced numerous community outreach programs. Most notable among these are Westside Isaiah Plan, Ezra Homes, and Pilgrim Village Homes, Washington Boulevard, new construction affordable housing development projects that built over 200 single-family homes in Chicago. In 2009, Hatch established Passports to the World, a biennial overseas African mission trip for the church's inner-city youth. He's also launched a visitation and correspondence ministry for the incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections and Cook County Jail, the Call to Life Substance Abuse Support Ministry, the Safe Haven CPS After School Program, and the Pilgrim Development Corporation of Pilgrim Village in West Garfield Park. Pastor Hatch is widely celebrated for his many decades of religious and civic involvement in the city of Chicago. He is the winner of a number of awards for leadership and has held several prestigious fellowships, including the Merrill Fellowship at Harvard Divinity School. So you can all see now why I said I was not worthy to be up here. So as you can see, we're very lucky to have a group of tremendously talented theologians up on this stage. I guess one question I'd like to ask, and maybe if it's okay, I'll ask Dr. Moss Jr. to start, is talk a bit about the history of the Black church. I know the Black church isn't a monolith, so I know that's a difficult question, but perhaps starting as you see it, and then we can kind of move to others. Talk about the history of the Black church in Chicago and what makes it unique.
Thank you very much, and I am more than honored to witness this gathering in this special place. I'm honored to be sitting beside my pastor, Otis Moss III. There was a time when he followed me around. And now I follow him around, consult with him and find out what he's reading and some of the things maybe I should be reading. It is dangerous to call on a minister to give open remarks.
Better than closing.
Let me say quickly that the first visit to Chicago was to a Baptist convention. And it was during the turbulent days of National Baptists. And out of that turbulence, the Progressive National Baptist Convention was born. So the first two visits I made to Chicago in my whole life, in my early life, was to a Baptist convention. I'll tell you a little story. At that time, the Progressive National Baptist Convention was in formation. I attended the National Baptist Convention, and when the nominating committee brought back a report to elect again the late Dr. J.H. Jackson, there was one negative vote in the auditorium. I only realized later what danger I was in. And they made the report. I stood against the nominating committee's recommendations and left that convention That was 1962, and made my way to the Progressive National Baptist Convention, where I've been involved since that time. I was involved in the organizational meeting of Progressive Baptists, but I did not join. So brokenhearted, disillusioned, discouraged by the behavior, the policies, and direction of the National Baptist Convention at the time. Dr. Gardner Taylor had run for president and lost. Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was put out of the convention, and my soul, my mind and heart said, how can you ever be comfortable in this kind of setting? But let me quickly say, I am honored tonight to be in a learning situation, to learn from this panel, to learn from this historic setting, and to be inspired by these fleeting moments, looking at the past, the present, and the future. A heavy subject for one evening. Thank you to Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III and the members of this panel and the leadership of these outstanding institutions. I came this evening to listen, to see, to observe, and to learn, believing that I can still learn something valuable at 89 years old. I'll stop there.
Now, some of you may know there's a West Side, South Side thing. So to avoid, I want to hear from Dr. Moss III, but I do, Dr. Hatch, I want to ask you to speak so I can still go back home to Maywood. So again, about just the history of the Black church and what makes it unique in Chicago.
Thank you, Brother Christian. And I shared with you earlier, because you are from Maywood, you are officially really a West Sider.
Okay.
And so
right.
I told you that explains the anointing on your life.
Well.
But I certainly appreciate being a part of this experience tonight, and it was fortuitous when we saw the one and only Dr. Otis Moss Jr. walk in. He is. I want to say this: everything that your son said in the introduction, I could have said, because I am an Otis Mossologist myself. And I knew every bit of it and know that it's true. But what an honor tonight. Chicago, the Black church in Chicago is, of course, as Dr. Moss described, was central. The president, longest serving president of the National Baptist Convention, Dr. Dave Jackson, pastored at 31st and what is now King Drive, was then South Park. And of course, he was literally like the king, the monarch of the Baptist movement among African Americans that has been described, Skip Gates called it in his book on the Black church, a nation within a nation. It was the largest gathering of African Americans in America. It had a history even before Dr. Jackson, who was himself a theologian, albeit very conservative, but the history of that movement that was a combination of the Western Baptists and then the Lot Carey Foreign Mission Convention and the National Baptists, and it merged in 1880, and it just becomes this incredible movement of people at the bottom of the American empire who gathered, whose president often gave what you would have considered a state of black America. And this was in the early part of the 20th century. E.C. Morris would literally give a state of black America, and all of this was happening below the radar in America. It was the largest gathering, some 50,000 delegates. It was like a trade wares convention. It was what created gospel music as an industry, was that people would go to this convention and sell their sheet music, Thomas Dorsey and others. And Chicago was central to that, to black church in America. And we'll have to make some distinction at some point, because there is not the black church. There are churches that have black people in them. But black church means, as Dr. Moss Jr. has shared, was in his bio, means a black theology, a black theological lens, a lens of experiencing the gospel at the bottom of the American empire. Chicago becomes central because Chicago is center in the country. It begins with the waterways and then the railways and then eventually even the airways of O'Hare Field. But Chicago is the major central distribution of the North American economy. And so when African Americans flooded into Chicago, escaping the terrorism of Mississippi, where my people came from, when they came to Chicago, they were coming to a place where the agricultural products on the planet were priced, which is Chicago. They were coming to the distribution center of North America, which is Chicago. So Sears and Roebuck's, who was like the precursor to Amazon, you could buy anything in a catalog and have it shipped from Chicago. When African Americans come and have this incredible, not only cultural impact, but impact in terms of its population, it is shape shifting. And so the fact that Chicago, as this major economic center, ends up with a population that is close to 50% and beyond, it makes black politics in Chicago very unique, meaning that black politicians could govern with a black political base and have some independence and agency in this metropolitan area that African Americans would have nowhere else in the country, which is why Harold Washington it becomes an international story. Because it wasn't like being the mayor of Los Angeles, where you would have to have a sort of compromised African American mayor, or New York. Chicago, you could govern from literal black power because of not only the population, but the economic base, the home of Ebony, the home of Jet, the home of Johnson Products, the home of Al Johnson Cadillac. Muhammad Ali moves here, Elijah Muhammad moves here, Jesse Jackson moves here. Martin King becomes a national leader because of the Chicago movement in 1966. And so when Harold Washington is elected, it sends tremors through the power structure. And Chicago still has not been the same, because there was a reaction to that that has destabilized black Chicago to this day, that will never happen again in terms of having someone whose money is black. Harold Washington's money was black, and his voters were black. And it was really not him, but he had the gifts to take advantage of a situation that was black power like nowhere else almost on planet Earth. And so we're still dealing with that destabilization. And so, the black church is in whatever condition the people are in. So is the church, because the church is the people. Mm.
So I want to talk a bit about the intergenerational aspect, but I want to see first if Dr. Moss, you have anything you want to add, or Marshall Jr.
Just to continue to paint the picture that Dr. Hatch already laid out, the Black church movement, or what I would call Black free space, the hush harbors, in the words of Toni Morrison, the clearing, spaces where we did not have to deal with a white gaze. That's what the Black church project has been. So the oldest Black church here in Chicago, 1847, is Quinn Chapel. Quinn Chapel had a large number of people who came from Mississippi and Arkansas, and there were 4 women at Quinn Chapel who were the leaders of the Underground Railroad. What they found out is when Black people arrived here that they thought they were in the north, but it was actually up south. So they had to, and they had to continue to move to Canada. So Quinn Chapel then becomes this space where Frederick Douglass is presenting, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the church grows to the point where they had to set up another church called Bethel AME Church. So you have this AME development early on, the first wave of free Black people who make their way up here to the Chicagoland area. Then you have a church such as Pilgrim Baptist Church. Now, Pilgrim is interesting because of the connection with Thomas Dorsey, but there's another connection in reference to, because there's a large number of people in Chicago who are from Mississippi. I always do a nice little joke at Trinity. I said, who has a cousin from Mississippi? Everybody stands up. But people in Mississippi who migrated to Chicago were fleeing racial terror, except those who are from Mound Bayou, Mississippi. That's another story, because Mound Bayou was a Black-controlled area. But many of them also were connected to what was known as the Daughtry Plantation. The Daughtry Plantation in Mississippi is the place where Robert Johnson learned how to play the guitar, Son House and Pop Staples. They then migrate here to Chicago, and then you have a musician from Georgia. He was a juke joint musician. They called him Georgia Tom. He comes to Chicago, and the sounds of Mississippi are mixing with the sounds of Georgia, and the creation of what we call the gospel sound, along with another woman who came from New Orleans who comes to Chicago by the name of Mahalia Jackson. And this music is born that is essentially a shifting of the blues with a new lyric. So gospel music is exactly the same as blues music. It just has a completely different lyric. One says, my baby's gone. The other says, precious Lord, take my hand. It's completely the same chord structure. So the continuation of this magnificent music movement of people who were migrating shifts again, because there was a gentleman by the name of Clarence Cobbs who was at Pilgrim, who connected with Thomas Dorsey, founds a church called First Church of Deliverance in 1929. While he is at First Church of Deliverance, there's a gentleman at First Church of Deliverance by the name of Kenneth Morris. And Kenneth Morris convinces Pastor Cobbs, who also founded the church, I might add, with a woman by the name of Reverend Mother Mattie. So you have a man and a woman, they are friends who found this church. And Kenneth Morris says to Pastor Cobbs, there is this instrument I want you to put in the church. It was called that time the Hammond B1 organ. That was the first church to have a Hammond organ. As a result, with the Mississippi Daughtry Plantation sound, now electrified with this new Hammond instrument, we then have what we know as the gospel sound. Now, every black church is they got a Hammond organ now. But then you have the Hammond that then added to a very African sound of call and response, because the Hammond organ could mimic the voice of the preacher and the congregation. So then when the preacher would close, there would be the Hammond organ would serve as the response to the preacher's close. But it was an echo of what happened in Mali, West Africa, when the griot was sharing the story of how God was working with the people would hum back to the griot, and that sound made its way to Mississippi into the Daughtry Plantation, then came all the way up to Chicago, and then all of a sudden the gospel sound is born, which has echoes of West Africa, and that's why Chicago Black Church is important.
We are now going to pass the plate and move to baptism. I want to be rebaptized. Look, let me ask a slightly different question, because I think we've gotten a really good arc of the history. Would love to, we could be here for 4 hours just talking about this and just how rich it is. And the idea of the church as this anchor of Chicago as a black Mecca in the United States. One question I think a lot about as a relatively young person, and I'm going to start with Marshall Hatch Jr. on this. I grew up in a black church, and one thing that a lot of folks don't always know is that whether you're a lawyer, a doctor, a nurse, whatever it is, so much of your life starts there. I learned to, the speeches that I gave as a politician, I learned to speak doing responsive reading and scripture reading in the church. I learned to, ask for resources in the church. And so, but so many folks, a generation, I'll say half generation, not that old, behind me, don't necessarily go to church in the same way, right? And so as we think about needs that are increasing in the black community in Chicago and across the United States, but in some cases, probably not folks here, attendance starting to decline. How do we revive the relevance of the black church for a younger generation? How does it speak to them? And Marshall Hatch Jr., I'll have you start, and then I'd love to hear from others as well.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I was going to say also, turn to your neighbor. I'm serious. Turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor, in case you didn't know, you're in black church. Sitting at the feet of these spiritual giants. Can you imagine what it must have been like, felt like, to grow up at his feet and hear him share stories about them? I don't know if the black church needs to be troubled with that question on relevance. I do remember in 2010, I think it was Eddie Glaude who penned that article, "The Black Church is Dead." I think it was meant to be provocative. But given the history of it and understanding that it is the leaven in the loaf of the American empire, as Pastor Hatch said, and it has always been. Understanding that when you hear Beyonce's country album, you're hearing black church. It will always be relevant in my mind, because I think of time and space, as you talked about, Dr. Moss, as cyclical, right? So the idea of MAAFA, or the idea of black church making miracles out of the MAAFA, that's what it's always been. That's what it will continue to be. There was a book by a sister named Marimba Ani called "Let the Circle Be Unbroken." And she talked about how African spirituality, everything that we heard Dr. Moss talk about, that history, how African spirituality saved Christianity from itself. And I think the larger conversation is, how can ex-evangelicals, and we've experienced this, young white evangelicals finding themselves in black spaces, black churches, and searching for redemption and finding it. Shout out to some of the students who are at the Div School now. I see you. Thanks for coming. led by Professor Cynthia Lindner. We co-teach a class called Theology in the Public Square. And they visited our church. Shout out to New Mount Pilgrim members who are here. Please raise your hand, give it up for them. They visited our church, they worshiped with us. Of course, the music was loud and lively, and the preaching was on point. And I remember reflecting with them, and the through line of their comments was, it felt so intimate. These are students who had never been to a black church, black space, but they were using the language of home. And so I think the larger question is, black church is not necessarily confined to four walls. It's the spirit of black church that continues to be renewed every generation. And I think we find that if we look for it actively.
Other thoughts on, kind of rejected the premise of my question, which makes total sense. Like, skip your question. Let me try asking it this way then, and I'll start with Otis Moss III. What, as we think about the troubles not just facing the black community, but American society, the world, what is the unique perspective, the unique hope that is brought by the black theological tradition? And what is the future of that tradition?
That's a great question. There are several theological, spiritual pillars that make up of what we consider to be the Black Church Project, Black spirituality, Black religiosity. One is that God is sovereign. Two is that the idea that the Holy Spirit is literally loose in the world, causing trouble everywhere. Third is that, in the words of Howard Thurman, that God, that the message of Christ speaks to those who have their backs against the wall. The fourth is that there is no sacred secular separation which comes out of that French Revolution, that European aspect, that you have something that's secular, something that's sacred, and black people witnessed that is problematic. Because if you have a separation, you can worship on Sunday and own slaves on Monday. And that was the project we were breaking. We believe that the sovereignty of the Spirit functioning in all spaces, and that is what is unique in the Black Church Project. I'll give a prime example of a story. I'm a preacher, so I traffic in stories. My apologies, but I have to traffic in this particular story because it gives an understanding of the idea of the Spirit being loose in the world. When I was about 14, I think it was about 14 or so, I was a part of this group called Jack and Jill, the bougie group, Jack and Jill. Some of y'all got the joke. And they were going to a concert. I didn't want to go to the concert because they were not artists I was interested in. One was, the opening artist was the group called DeBarge, and the headliner was Luther Vandross. I was a hip-hop head. I'm rock him till I die. And so I didn't want to go. The only reason I went is because there was a young lady I thought was cute, so I said I was going to go. That's what you do at 14, why you go. And so I went to the concert, and after DeBarge did their I Like It stuff, and then Luther came on. I was not a Luther fan, didn't know much about Luther whatsoever. And we were in this place called the Front Row, which was a theater in the round, where it would spin, so that no matter where you were like in the front row. And Luther came out and sang a song and started talking about a house. Y'all know it. It's not a home. A chair is just a chair. I mean, I was dumbfounded. I'd never heard anybody sing like this. But what was fascinating was someone in the third row started shouting like it was Sunday morning. And as I looked closer, I said, she goes to my church. And she shouted that way on Sunday, the same way she did on Saturday. Because the Spirit she wasn't shouting for Luther, she was shouting for the sonic spiritual power that was coming through Luther Vandross. And that is the understanding that there is no sacred and secular separation. So when young people organize and break into "we gonna be all right," they say that the Spirit has descended because we believe that the Spirit is loose in the world. And one of the powerful things about the Pentecostal tradition is that the Pentecostal tradition with which we would say, oh, it has this patriarchy, it has these power and hierarchy relationships, but they believe that Spirit trumps doctrine, which is an interesting idea since the Pentecostal movement, which is an indigenous African-American movement like jazz that was born in Azusa Street. I'm talking about a movement, not a denomination. And when William Seymour, who was the founder of that movement, in terms of the structure and the leadership of that church, was men and women, deacons, not deaconess, as leaders and as preachers, and Latino and Asian. And according to the record, those who were Latino did not speak English, the black folk didn't speak Spanish, but they said the Spirit descended and they understood each other. That movement was undermined by white supremacy. Because when white charismatic observers, not Pentecostal, showed up, they couldn't understand the idea that here you have black, Latino, Asian, and you had white women who were a part of this movement, and then they wrote some horrific things that ended up in the LA Times, and William Seymour said this. He said, the Spirit could break class. The Spirit could break gender walls. The Spirit could break everything, but the Spirit couldn't break racism because racism is an idol. Blew me away. He said, until that is removed. And so the project of the black church recognizes this idea. And the church functions, the black church did not start in buildings. It started in clearings. And the church is returning to where it started, where people are gathering, the Spirit is descending, and they are being directed in a particular way. And I'm excited about it because we are witnessing the Spirit on 87 in Cottage Grove, but not within a building. Right on a corner, what some would call a cipher, but now they're calling a gathering, where we end up doing poetry together and then praying. The Spirit descends in these unique, unconventional ways, and that's what the Black Church Project brings to America, or in the words of Dr. Gardner C. Taylor. It may be the people who were marginalized and pushed aside in America who will have to save America from itself. And that's what the Black Church Project, not churches that just have black people, as Dr. Hatch said. There are churches that have just black people, and they're usually, throwing money on an altar and talking about prosperity, and they're just capitalists in ecclesiastical garments. That's a whole other thing. But the Black Church Project has been about human flourishing since its inception.
Other responses to that? Future and transformation of the Black Church Project? Otherwise, I know we need time for questions as well at some point. But do you have something? Go ahead, please.
Two maybe brief things. I spoke of my first experience in Chicago and sort of underscored something negative. But I also want to lift up something out of that first experience, not negative at all. I went to a late night service during that convention. And guess who was preaching? A gentleman from Detroit, out of Mississippi, by the name of C.L. Franklin. he gave the message. Now, this is 1962. And he preached from a familiar text, and the Word became flesh. The interesting thing about C.L. Franklin's sermon that night was his critical introduction to the text. He started out by saying, probably the person we think wrote this gospel didn't write it. And he went on to explain why. That the person we attribute to writing that gospel was probably dead when that gospel was written. Now, this was what the average person would not expect, this kind of historical, exegetical, critical analysis of Scripture. And he went on through that. And then he went on to talk about what it means when the Word becomes flesh. And before he finished, we were all shouting. We had forgotten about the controversy in the convention, and we were focusing on the Word became flesh. Fast forward, 1967, on the campus of the University of Chicago, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference held a special meeting under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And Dr. King opened some very challenging ideas in that meeting about a guaranteed annual income, about ending poverty in America, and the enslavement of the American economy. And then made an announcement that the board of directors of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had decided to go national with a thing called Operation Breadbasket. And that the national director of Operation Breadbasket would be a young seminary student by the name of Jesse Jackson. A few months following that meeting and in the process of organizing the Poor People's Campaign, Dr. King was assassinated. Jesse Jackson took on national leadership and later global leadership out of a black church, an African American church setting taking place on the campus of the University of Chicago in the Rockefeller Chapel. Isn't that amazing? Now, the University of Chicago, to some extent, came into being, I understand, because Senior Rockefeller wanted to start a university in Cleveland where he was not very well liked. And some of the older millionaires said, we don't want Rockefeller money in Cleveland. It's tainted. They had not learned from Booker T. Washington, who said it tain't enough. But Rockefeller moved to Chicago, not physically, but moved some of his resources to Chicago and helped to found the University of Chicago. We are meeting 1967 on that campus in spite of some of the early ideologies of the founders of the university. Here, at that time, a radical group in the eyes of many called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, appointing a young seminary student, not yet 25 years old, to head up a national program called Operation Breadbasket to deal with economic injustice in the nation. Dr. King also lifted up the horrors of the war in Vietnam. And he also lifted up the eternality of nonviolence. And he talked about the short-lived efforts of violent movements and the long-term life and value of nonviolence. And he used Montgomery as an example. He said, in Montgomery, we marched, we walked 381 days, and we were stronger morally at the end of the 381 days than we were at the beginning. And then he talked about the life of a violent urban rebellion. What is the average life of that kind of rebellion? And how much moral authority do we have at the end of the average rebellion in our inner cities called riots? At that time, I think the average life of one of those rebellions was about 5 to 7 days. And what condition did they leave those areas where the quote-unquote rebellion took place? Out of that church, black church setting on the campus of the University of Chicago, a revolution was announced that is incomplete. The incomplete revolution of liberation, anchored in love, justice, truth, transformation, and all of the attendant parts. Incomplete. And we have the challenge to continue. We will not complete in our lifetime, but we have the responsibility to continue this revolution of justice, anchored in love and truth with the goals of liberation, transformation, and ultimately reconciliation. Now, some folk want reconciliation before liberation. And that kind of reconciliation means, as I've said throughout my life, that means stand still while I stand on your neck. Transformation must take place before reconciliation. Truth must be at the table, alive. Justice and truth are inseparable. And when we combine love, justice, truth, transformation, liberation, we can move toward reconciliation. Now, I talked longer because you said amen. So I'm going to stop now and pass the mic on to someone else who is much younger than I am and preferred before me.
We are. Unless somebody wants to try to follow that, we are technically, I think, at time. So let me say, first of all, what an honor it is for me to sit on this stage, feeling, again, very unworthy. And to all of you for coming, I think what's very clear is that we, as a university, as a city, as a country, owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to the Black church and Black liberation theology, and that furthermore, in addition to the road that we have come thanks to the sacrifices of many of the folks on this stage, there are also, the church, I would say, is in very, very good hands, and we are very grateful to all of you for your continued work and for all of your historical work as well. So thank you guys so much. Let's give them a round of applause. If we have questions, are there mics out in the audience? What's our deal? Nah? Do we want to have? Do we have a mic? Or does somebody just want to? Yeah, we have an extra. Okay, if you have a question, you want to just raise your hand, we'll run it to you. Okay, I see one. These lights are like right in my face, y'all. So like I'm just trusting in God that that's actually a hand I see.
All right.
Well, just give your name and ask your question.
My name is Jonathan. I am a doctoral candidate at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, but it's not about me. I am very humbled to be in the presence of these dignified, magnificent ministers of the gospel and who have been tasked with leading the salvation history of us as a peculiar people in the context of this country. And I have a question that is of a historical and social nature, but also impinges upon the theological. And so I'd be very happy to receive whatever insight or thoughts you all might have to share. In the context of this country, is it possible as a matter of strategy to extract a cultural ethos, way of life, or mode of existence from the gospel proclamation of so-called Christianity that is capable of seriously addressing the persistent forms of anti-Black evil, or does it, in your view, irreducibly demand faith in the gospel itself? In other words, is the problem of anti-Black so bad that nothing else will really do?
That's a thesis question. I don't know who wants to take a shot. It's definitely not me. Reverend Hatch?
if I can understand it, and it is a profound question that seems at the core to be what to do with white people. I think. What will ever change that dynamic? That's not necessarily a question that Black church entertains. It entertains, first of all, the question of how to be empowered in a context that has been structured to disempower you, which is why the gathering is so important. The theology is so important. And so when you look at Black church, it is the result of a reaction against oppression. There was no reason to have a church or believe in God if it wasn't going to get you free, if it wasn't going to empower you. So the whole project comes out of a context. It's contextual theology, how to empower ourselves in a context that has been structured to dehumanize, to disempower, and to disenfranchise. And so it's the strength of gathering together and creating community with the ethos that Dr. Moss III has mentioned. So when we look at what Black church does at its best, it creates community among the disinherited to empower ourselves at the bottom of an imperial project. And so in that respect, the ethos, what emerges out of Black church, like Dr. Moss Jr. was sharing about Dr. King, while he was meeting at the University of Chicago in '67, he was hanging out on the west side at the very bottom of the empire. See, that's Black church ethos. It means that none of us are free until all of us are free. And if you want the kingdom of God to arrive, the margins have to come to the center. When those on the margins become central to public policy, then the kingdom has arrived. That's a Black church ethos, because it's the place everybody is welcome. We created family out of rape, which is why we all these colors. We created family out of being excluded from others. We created a community that welcomed everybody. Even rejected white people, Even Dylan knew he could go to a Black church because they'll take anybody. Even though he went there to kill people, he was welcomed into their prayer meeting. And what kind of people turn around less than 24 hours? Well, we forgive them. You know, we got to do what the Lord says. It's an incredible ethic that emerges out of the Black church experience. That what we need to do, first of all, is learn to forgive each other. That's where it should start. So Dr. King organized on the west side as a predominant place of organizing. When they came from the Justice Department looking for Dr. King, they were trying to find out where they could find. They found him early in the morning, hanging out with the vice lords on 16th Street, trying to teach them how to be parade marshals to keep nonviolent order. That's where they found him. because the West Side itself was, of course, the last communities in Black Chicago settled by migrants from the South. So we're a little more organic, a little more closer to the earth, a little more country, a little more welcoming, friendly, sufficiently disconnected from the power dynamic of Chicago that he could organize there. And so the substance of Black theology is that you have to start at the absolute bottom, the most abused. And we recognize what's missing on this panel is the womanist voice. Because nobody has been more victimized by the slavetocracy than the Black woman, who, when the slave trade was cut off, their womb became the economic engine of the American empire. And so I don't know that it's about transforming white people as much as it is, as I think the panelists have said, returning to our true selves, which is this high ethic of everybody has value, everybody has worth, all of us are made in the image of God, everybody in, nobody out, and beginning to reestablish that as the central ethic of our faith communities, and then ultimately give that gift to the world. But you know, I don't know that it's about changing white people, because that's not my job. But loving Black people is my job. And trying to teach my own people how to have community with each other, and for us who are the Christian faith, you know, with Christ at the center. So that is the continuation, I think, of the project that Dr. Moss Jr. is sharing, that we believe that ultimately the gift we give to the world is being the highest order of humanity.
Have any other questions? I can't even see, so I just believe you.
Hello.
Faith in action.
I think
Hello, my name is Matthew. I'm actually a Northern Seminary student. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm actually a Northern Seminary student. My question is a practical question. What does intergenerational ministry look like between young Black ministers and older Black ministers for the sake of reaching Black faces in Chicago, reaching this next generation of Black faces in Chicago?
I think it looks like this, number one. I think what has been created at the MAAFA Redemption Project, and I hate to plug it like this, but it's what I see, is a crystal clear example of what that looks like. So at the MAAFA Redemption Project, we engage young men from the neighborhood, 18 all the way up, sometimes younger. Monikers to describe these young men have been documented gang member, even at risk is something that I'm opposed to in terms of describing them. But if that helps you understand who we work with, then so be it. But they are currently being mentored every day by Black men who are returning citizens and who received Black Jesus as their salvation. I don't know how else to say it. And they have Bible study with these young men every single day at 9 a.m. And then after that, of course, there's a workforce development component, there's a mental health component, there's housing and all of the wraparound. But the core of it is that discipleship, that relationship building. And so I think what I'm seeing is a movement, essentially, of black men who have gone in and come out of these dehumanizing systems of mass incarceration and have been received by Black Church, which is New Mount Pilgrim. And essentially, they are the core of it. And even more than that, you know, the young men who have gone through MAAFA have now been deputized. And so they serve as ambassadors to reach even younger people, you know, who are doing the carjackings and all of that. And I remember one instance. There was a young man in the first cohort by the name of Elbert Mullen, who he was actually tragically killed in 2020, but he was a part of our first cohort. And I remember sitting with him just trying to understand the subculture of gun violence in Chicago. And I sat with him and listened to the music that he listens to. And I started to understand drill music for what it is. And he showed me a song by Lil Durk. I don't know if you know it. He showed me a song by Lil Durk called Nobody Knows. And I sat there and I asked him, I said, do you know that this is the same song that Louis Armstrong sang, Nobody Knows? And did you know that it was a spiritual, essentially? Of course he didn't. And I don't even know if Lil Durk did. But I understood drill music as really an extension of even blues. Because of the conditions in neighborhoods like a West Garfield Park, even now, it's similar to Gaza right now. And so the music has a despair to it. And when I showed him Louis Armstrong's version, nobody knows the trouble I've seen, nobody knows but Jesus. Then he goes, glory, hallelujah. At that moment, me and Brother Mullen, we had a conversation about why do you think he would say glory, hallelujah after saying nobody knows but Jesus? And then we landed at the subversive joy, which is at the core of the ethos of Black Church. And that kind of intergenerational conversation is not just happening at the MAAFA Redemption Project. I'm sure it's happening in a lot of other Black spaces. But I think that's what's going to carry us forward. That's going to be the Sankofa, right? Recognizing the wisdom of our elders, taking that and charting an Afrofuturist vision of Black Church.
I can't see. Okay. All right. I think we are ending here. Wait, we got. Okay. This has got to be the last one if it's happening because I'm getting the X's.
I'm humbled, honored, inspired to be in your presence. Thank you for bringing the Spirit to us here tonight. For white people, individuals, and congregations who recognize our complicity in the system that keeps Black people at the bottom of the American empire, who recognizes that God is on the side of those who are mistreated and who recognize that God is on the side of the poor and the oppressed. What can we do as individuals and as congregations to partner and to help? Either what can we do individually, or what can we do as and what can we do, broadly and specifically? And if we are at a time, then I can just ask some of you afterward. But apologies for keeping us even longer.
One of the things I think is important to deconstruct whiteness and recognize that whiteness is white in relationship to blackness. When all the black people leave the room, collective white people get to be ethnic again, because whiteness is in relationship to blackness. If you go to O'Hare and fly to England, they never say, "Welcome, white people." They say, "You're American. Oh, your last name. Are you Scottish? Are you French?" You have ethnicity. And whiteness is not a culture. It's a construct. Blackness, the idea of black, when black people speak of blackness, we're speaking culture and context, structure, but also subversive nature of who we are, because we're unable to pinpoint specifically where we are. And so being able to deconstruct that, I think, becomes part of the project for our country collectively. Because I like to say it this way: every culture has food. There's no white food. There's no white food. But there are ethnicities that have food. There's French food, and there's Scottish food, and Irish food. So when we root ourselves in our culture, we find that there are commonalities where we can then deconstruct empire. But as long as we hold on to the marker of empire, then it's difficult to deconstruct empire. I like to put it this way: there are so many people in America who think they're Jedis, but they actually work for the empire. And when George Lucas created Star Wars, it was to be a critique on American empire. The empire, Darth Vader and all of them, was America, and he was reflecting on the Vietnam War. The Jedi Knights, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the freedom movement, he was inspired. He said the Jedis will deconstruct the empire. And only when the empire joins with the Jedis, but they have to deconstruct the residue of the empire that's still on them. And so it becomes a project where we have to deconstruct these things, and something powerful happens when we recognize that America there were if you read literature in the 1600s, there's no whiteness. The shift happens after the Bacon Rebellion in Virginia, that the Virginia laws begin to say, we don't want enslaved Africans to connect with those who are white, or well, they weren't called white, indentured servants from Europe, because they will realize that the real problem is the person who owns the land. But in the words of David Roediger, whiteness became a wage. I'm not going to give you more money, but I'm going to give you privilege over these people and keep you fighting so that you don't realize that I'm trying to take everybody's money and everybody's land. And that's what we're seeing in this generation, and that's why hip-hop has been so powerful, because hip-hop has critiqued economically, I'm talking critiqued economically, critiqued culture, and you have generations of people globally who have been raised around this black cultural aesthetic and are not satisfied with the crumbs of empire. And if we can take down the empire, or at least take out the Death Star, we might have a future where our children's children can say, we gonna be all right.
We have now talked about the blues, the black church, and Star Wars. This has been my perfect evening. So I want to say thank you to everybody for coming out, and God bless you all. Thank you so much.